So this morning I continue the series that Pastor Pam and I have been doing all summer called I Don't Believe That. We talked about that briefly at the beginning of service. This is a summer-long process in which we are exploring topics of faith from the tradition of Christianity, ones that many contemporary Christians struggle with, some maybe less than others. And today we picked one from among the group. We talked about original sin, we talked about hell, salvation, the rapture, the virgin birth, the creeds, and today we talk about miracles. And I would venture to say miracles is something that we actually talk about more often in our contemporary time. And yet, I wonder how many of us believe they can happen. So my friends, I'm here to tell you today that I need this sermon. Do you? We live in a time and a place in the world here in the United States that stresses the rational and puts down the superstitious, that lifts up science and fact. And this is a good thing in so many ways. Right now we are really struggling in our country with leaders who are turning away from policies and directions based on science, who are calling facts lies, and who are using proven lies as the basis of new policies. So I am horrified by this trend, and I am the last person to tell you to turn away from facts and science and rational thought in determining how we should live our lives in the world today. But there are needs of the heart and the spirit that beg for something beyond what we know, to what we hope. When a loved one is sick, it doesn't help to look at the statistics of the outcomes that are likely, or to know the medical reasons why the person is sick, or even to understand the chemistry of the medicines that will be used. When someone is sick who we love, we say, we need a miracle right now. We'll ask friends to pray, even the ones who don't believe in it. When I have been sick, I had friends who told me they were atheists who said, but I'm praying for you anyway. Yeah. And I've had atheist friends ask me to pray for them in a time of trouble. When a conflict between peoples persists beyond generations and continues to be the source of terrible suffering and killing, like the one amidst the Israelis and Palestinians. I listen to the stories on all sides, and I think it's more than 70 years. It's 70 years since the formation of Israel, but it goes back so much further than that. I think to myself, it's going to take a miracle to achieve lasting peace. It's not going to be better negotiations or new politicians. It's not going to be because people have come to their senses. I think we're going to need a miracle. And what are we asking for when we say or think these things? Albert Nolan writes, miracles are very often thought of by both those who believe in them and those who don't, as an event that contradicts the laws of nature and that therefore can't be explained by science or reason. Does that sound about right to you? Is that what you think a miracle is? Something that contradicts reason. You might have other explanations. I mean, there are many things, I think, in the world that are incredibly miraculous that we don't do, but they happen. I don't need alone to understand the physics of why the earth rotates around the sun the way it does to be blown away when I see a gorgeous sunrise, and to think to myself how miraculous that is, right? And if any of you have ever been present at the birth of a child, I'm sure you will agree with me that it doesn't matter how much science you understand, it doesn't matter how many ultrasounds you saw that showed you how the baby was growing, or the science you know about how humans reproduce when that baby is born. It is a miracle. But I'm going beyond this type of the miraculous to talk about the kinds of miracles that Jesus did, which are the kind where he changed something and made it whole. And there were many different kinds that he did. We'll come back to that. In the reading that we heard today, this is a particularly important passage because the very first thing that happens is that Jesus is with his crowd of disciples. They're following his teachings. He's preaching to the people, and he comes across this widow and the bier that is carrying her son who has died, and all the people who are part of the funeral procession. And it says in the text, although it's minimized in English, it says in the text that Jesus was moved by compassion for the widow. And out of that compassion came a miracle. Because he stops, and in the face of her heartbreak, takes the hand of his son and brings him back to life. This happens, and then the very next story in Luke's gospel is that John the Baptist's followers come to Jesus. You know, John's been hearing of these things. By now, John is, working in the Jordan baptizing people, and Jesus is coming along. I think actually by this point in the text, he's in prison, and he's hearing these stories. And even though he has baptized Jesus, and he knows that Jesus is a holy person who is practicing in the valley, he sends his disciples to him and say to him, "Are you the one we've been waiting for?" And what does Jesus say back? He doesn't say, "Have you been listening to my teaching?" He doesn't say, "Do you know whose son I am and where I was born?" May God be with the people in need for whom that ambulance is going. When Jesus answers the prayer, the request of the followers of John the Baptist, he identifies himself first and foremost as a miraculous healer. He describes what he's been doing. And he says, "This is how you can know that I am the one who is to come." Joseph Fitzmyer quotes first-century historian. Now, this person was not a Christian. He was a Jewish historian, Josephus, who describes Jesus at the time as a worker of wondrous deeds. And the Bible records lots of miracles performed by Jesus. So the Bible does not consider this small. This is not a minimal part of Jesus' life on earth. They appear in all four Gospels and in other books of the New Testament. I counted myself at least 18 healings of illness and injury, many of which repeat in the other Gospels. 4 exorcisms, which are healings from demons, and 8 counts of miraculously controlling nature, such as walking on water, or multiplying food, or calming a storm. And then there's 3 accounts of bringing someone who's dead back to life. So clearly, to the gospel writers and the apostles, Jesus' healing ministry was a crucial sign of who he was and the difference about the way he was bringing God intimately to the earth in his time. And the early church absolutely counted this as a main part of their work, as spreading the gospel to Christ in the world. It was also hugely emphasized that they had to do a healing ministry. Frank Darling examined what's known about the healing acts done by the first generation of apostles, so that's between approximately 24 and 100 CE. He counts 7 incidents of healing by the apostles and their followers, and they used techniques just like Jesus did: laying on of hands, a healing command, touching, anointing a person with oil. And once, an account tells of people being healed when Peter's shadow fell on them in the street. Miraculous healing persisted after the first apostles died out. There are written recordings through the 2nd through 4th centuries of many, many healings that took place in the early church. Rodney Stark considers the healing ministries of the early church to have played a significant role in the spread of Christianity through the first 2 centuries. He examines the occurrence of 2 lethal illnesses, epidemics that swept the Roman Empire. In 165, it was possibly smallpox. And in 251, it was possibly measles. But they were considered plagues of their time, and they killed about a third of the Roman Empire. It was both times. They were huge epidemics. But Christianity flourished in the face of such a grisly, hopeless time by having hope that that transcended death, which the dominant pagan religions didn't have. And by having coping strategies during that time of despair with the values of love and charity. While the pagans were running the other way from their relatives who fell sick with these plagues, the Christians were staying and healing them and loving them and risking their lives to do it because they believed in the power of God through Christ. But as we get through to the 4th century, there's a decided shift that begins to happen in the church away from the healing ministries after Constantine, the emperor, legalized Christianity. At the same time, the first hospital-type places were forming where you could take a sick person to be healed. And so it began to be happening outside of the home, outside of the places of worship. And there were doctors who now were congregating in places and healing people. It was also less and less emphasized by the leaders of the church. By the time it got to the Reformation period, which is the medieval ages, the 15th and 16th centuries, Martin Luther and John Calvin, who are the progenitors of our branch of the church, argued that miracles had largely ceased at the close of the apostolic era, which is about the 2nd, 3rd centuries. That their belief was that these amazing miracles happened to give divine authority to Jesus, to the first apostles, to the spreading of the gospel. But that Protestant thought should really shift its focus and move away from ideas that now the Reformers considered magical and superstitious, and focus instead on behaving in a Christ-like way in ordinary life, toward compassionate action and relief of suffering. These are things that I'm sure sound very familiar to how we practice today. An increased focus on the scriptures and the ministries of Jesus, coupled with new ancient documents that were discovered as we got closer to the 19th century. These shifted our focus to the historical Jesus, and in the age of the Enlightenment made us focus more on thought and rational experience. And so there was less and less emphasis on the healing ministries and less belief that modern people could do it. But healing ministries have persisted, and this is an area where the Pentecostal and evangelical churches are much better than we are. They still do healing ministries that often have very profound effect on people's lives. Graham Eakin noted that 20th century healers have been showing significant public witness that healing of the miraculous kind can still happen even today. There was a writer named Agnes Sanford, whose book I have read. Hers is called The Healing Light, and she's someone who in the 40s and 50s discovered that she actually, through prayer, in an apostolic way, could bring true healing in a miraculous way to people, and she wrote about it, and increasing people followed her. It was done through intercessory prayer and the laying on of hands. There's an Episcopal minister, Morton Kelsey, who himself writes of experiences after he read Agnes's book, that he took the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer and he took the prayers of healing and he started to use them, and people started to be healed. When he started trying to talk about this, both with doctors and with clergy, he was shocked. It was the doctors who wanted to talk to him about it, and the clergy who sort of couldn't be bothered. That when a large hospital where he convened a meeting to talk about spiritual healing, pulled together the community, 80% of the physicians who were invited came, and less than 30% of the clergy attended. And he has a theory about this. Kelsey explores the reason why he thinks American Protestant churches have increasingly not validated or believed any longer that it was possible. One is the materialistic conviction that our bodies can be cared for adequately by doctors and hospitals, that medicine and science have advanced to the point that they do a good enough job. The second is the idea that sickness has a role to play as God's direct and maybe disciplinary gift to people. Not all of us believe that, but that is certainly an idea that has persisted in Christianity. A third is that this notion called dispensation, that God made something different happen in the first few centuries of the church so that the church could have power of conversion and spreading of the word, so people would believe in the power of Christ. But that era passed. And fourth, in the rise of rational materialism and existentialism that really taught us culturally that there is no supernatural agency which can break into the physical world, ruled by natural law. My 22-year-old son was giving me a very intellectual expounding on just this a couple of nights ago at dinner to explain why he doesn't believe in God. How ironic it is, then, that we are now in a time in the latter 21st century, in the latter 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, when it is scientists from the material world who are finding that they can't only treat the body without treating the spirit. Doctors are increasingly doing research and joining with people on forms of meditation practice, on hands-on healing practices that they actually use increasingly in hospitals. Many of you may remember that a couple of years ago I had a major surgery, brain surgery. And I went to Brigham and Women's Hospital, which is a forefront hospital in our time. And when I was there, I was encouraged upon admission to practice visualization and meditations on healing as a part leading up to the surgery, during the surgery, to ask my surgeons to do the same, and after. And I was offered Reiki, which is a hands-on energy healing technique, while I was in the hospital. So, we are finding in our scientific age that treating of the body alone is not enough for people to be fully well, to be fully healed, that there's also the healing of the spirit and the heart that needs to happen, and it may not be science that can do that for us alone. So how can we be people who claim Jesus as a central force in our faith life leave out such a significant part of who he was on earth, a doer of miracles, a healer of such deep compassion? Can we keep the good that as liberal progressives we embrace? In the honoring of rational thought and the findings of science, we know that it's crucial to hold on to these things because many superstitious beliefs lead to the condemnation and the marginalization of other people, and maybe the destruction of the natural world. There's so much that happens if we go only with superstition. But at the same point in time, we may be condemning ourselves to a life without the hope of the healing power of Christ that was such a huge gift that he brought to the earth. This is our deep challenge as 21st century Christians in a liberal part of the church. So let's look back at Jesus and his healing and consider if there's a way to do the both and. Because clearly, God gave us all of these things, right? We have brains that were given to us. All of the learning that has happened across the millennia, it has happened because God gave us these gifts. So I don't believe for a second that we're not supposed to use them. But we didn't only get brains, we also got hearts and spirits that detect the things that aren't so visible to the five senses, that aren't so easily figured out only through rational thought. Can we bring to people what Jesus brought, which is just as powerful today as it was then, because he emphasized bringing people into the direct experience of God, that through him and his compassion, they might feel that God had come near. God wasn't just stories in the Bible, but an active presence that happened when we love one another. His compassion through his touch, through the fact that he went to people who were considered outsiders and in exile, who he touched the people who he wasn't supposed to touch according to the law of his time. And through his forgiveness and his non-judgment and his invitation to new life, the power of God restored them to wholeness. Now surely, there is so much of this we can still do today. Albert Nolan talks about how Jesus healed like this. He says, Jesus' one and only motive for healing people was compassion. It wasn't to prove to anybody saw people suffering. The gospel accounts say this over and over, that he would meet them where they were. His only desire was to liberate them from their suffering and their fatalistic resignation to it. He was deeply convinced that this could be done, and that the miraculous success of his efforts must be attributed to the power of his faith. What he wanted to do, Nolan says, is evoke the same compassion and the same faith in the people around him. That's what Jesus' mission was about. He hoped that that alone would enable the power of God to become operative right then, right now, even today, in the now, not the past, but the present. Nolan writes, wherever the general atmosphere of fatalism was replaced by an atmosphere of faith, the impossible began to happen. And Graham Eichen concludes, we can no longer be content in our current time to preach a gospel of hope for the future without adjusting things in the now. It wasn't by accident that Christ coupled the command to preach the gospel of good news with the healing of the sick. They went together. The healing of the sick was the expressed reality that the kingdom of God was at hand. So can you and I, allow the miraculous that we can't explain to coexist with the science and the facts of modern life that we value just because we can't explain? Not magic tricks, but real galvanizing healing that Jesus modeled for us. One in which the untouchable are touched, and the unlovable are loved, and those who are despaired are given real hope that God is present, imminently, intimately, now. That those who are hurting can be restored, and that we who are fatalistic, that things can never be changed, are convicted that anything is possible.